I didn't plan to say anything. My name is Nadia Hollister, and I'd spent 32 years of my life learning how to be quiet in rooms where my family was loud. The Christmas dinner where everything changed started exactly like every other Christmas dinner. My mother had set the table with the good china, the set she bought at an estate sale in 2009 and only brought out when company was coming. My brother had arrived 40 minutes late with his wife Celeste, not her real name, but she'd been going by it since college, and we'd all agreed to stop questioning it, and their two kids, who immediately ran to the living room and turned on the television without asking. My father was in the kitchen pretending to help while actually just drinking eggnog and watching football highlights on his phone. And I was in the corner near the fireplace, arranging the cheese board my mother had asked me to put together, listening to the sound of my family moving around me like I was a piece of furniture they'd learned to walk around. That was my spot in this family, near the walls. Useful but not particularly noticed. I want to tell you about who I was before I tell you about what happened. Not because I need you to feel sorry for me, I don't, but because I've realized that when you spend your whole life being misunderstood by the people who were supposed to know you best, you start to lose track of yourself. And I spent a long time lost. My brother, I'll call him by the name he answers to at work, because that's the version of him who matters in this story, went by Tanner, 3 years older than me. Broad-shouldered, easy smile, the kind of man who could walk into a room and get handshakes from people he'd never met. He'd always been the one my parents talked about first, in introductions, in prayers at the dinner table, in the annual Christmas card that my mother mailed to 47 people every December. He'd gone to state school on a partial scholarship, worked his way into sales, and by 35, owned a small landscaping company in the suburbs of Columbus, Ohio, that did well enough to pay for a 4-bedroom house and 2 lease vehicles. My mother loved telling people about Tanner. Me? I'd taken a different road, a quieter one. After I graduated from Ohio State, yes, the same school, though nobody ever brought that up in the same breath, I'd moved to Chicago at 23 with $1,200 in a checking account and a freelance web design client I'd found on Craigslist. I spent 2 years eating peanut butter crackers for dinner and wearing the same 4 outfits on rotation. I took every project I could get. I taught myself back-end development through YouTube tutorials and library books. I built a small reputation, then a slightly larger one. By 28, I had 3 ongoing retainer clients and a stable income. By 30, I'd started a small digital consultancy with a partner I'd met at a networking event. We had 6 employees and a downtown office with a view of the lake. I had never told my parents the specifics of any of this. Not because I was hiding it, but because nobody had ever asked. When I came home for holidays, my mother would ask if I was still doing that computer stuff. My father would nod when I mentioned Chicago like it confirmed some suspicion he had about the city. My brother would talk about his Q4 revenue and his new equipment in the commercial contract he'd just signed, and my parents would lean in close, eyes bright, asking follow-up questions like they were taking notes. And I would finish my food and clear my plate and ask if anyone wanted more wine. One Christmas, when I was 29, my mother had introduced me to one of my aunt's friends who was visiting. And this is our daughter, Nadia. She lives in Chicago, does something with computers. The woman had nodded pleasantly and turned immediately back to my aunt. I had walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a full minute, running cold water over my wrists, just breathing. I'd told myself it didn't matter. I'd told myself I was past needing their approval. I'd told myself a lot of things. The year I turned 32, I got the call about Aunt Vera. Vera was my mother's older sister, the one who lived in a craftsman bungalow in Portland, who sent birthday cards with $20 bills inside until I was well into my 20s, who had once driven 8 hours in a single day just to come to my college graduation because she knew my parents had only stayed for an hour before leaving to make it back for Tanner's rec league soccer game. She was the only person in my family who had ever called me by a nickname she invented specifically for me. She called me Dee because she said Nadia was too formal for someone who laughed the way I did. Vera had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's 2 years prior. She wasn't declining fast, but she wasn't the same. When she called me in October to ask if I'd come for Christmas at my parents' house, she was going to be there, she said. She wanted to see everyone together. I said yes before she finished the sentence. I hadn't planned on staying for the whole dinner. I was going to drive up from Columbus, where I'd gotten an Airbnb to avoid the pull-out couch situation at my parents' house, spend the day, and drive back. clean and manageable. What I hadn't planned for was the moment right before dinner was served. We were all gathered in the living room. My parents, Tanner and his wife Celeste, their two kids, Vera, and my parents' neighbors Paul and Fran, who joined every year and who I genuinely liked because they asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. 14 people in total, if you counted the kids. My mother was in the middle of one of her hosting monologues. She did this every year, a sort of oral tour of the family's accomplishments, framed as gratitude, but functioning more like a press release. She had been talking about Tanner for about 4 minutes. The commercial contract, the new service trucks, a mention of Celeste's volunteer work at the kids' school. Then she turned to me. I actually thought for 1/2 second that she was going to say something about Chicago, about the consultancy, about anything. Instead, she smiled at the room and said, "And Nadia's been kind enough to drive up from Columbus. She helps people with their websites." She said it the way you'd say someone had brought rolls. Paul, from next door, looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fran touched her wine glass. Vera went very still in the armchair in the corner. Tanner's wife Celeste laughed lightly and said, "Oh, that's sweet. That's sweet. That's sweet." I looked at the cheese board I'd arranged. I looked at the fire I'd built in the fireplace when my father said he couldn't get it going. I looked at my hands in my lap. I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid, but because I had learned, very carefully, over a very long time, that the moments when you want to speak the most are sometimes the moments when staying quiet costs people the most. I let the conversation move on. I ate dinner. I helped clear the table. I listened to Tanner talk about his Q1 projections while our father asked follow-up questions. What my mother did not know, what neither of my parents knew, was that Paul, who lived next door, was the regional VP of operations for a commercial real estate firm in Columbus. And 3 months earlier, his firm had become one of my consultancy's largest clients. We were in the middle of a full digital infrastructure overhaul for them. Paul had been my point of contact on the project for 6 weeks before we'd ever met in person. We had a standing Tuesday call. He knew exactly who I was. He had known for the entire dinner. After dessert, when people were moving to the living room with coffee, Paul came to stand next to me near the hallway. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just said, quietly, "I had no idea this was your family." I said I knew. He said, "We should loop in our legal team next week for the contract expansion, by the way. I've been meaning to ask, are you comfortable with a 12-month renewal at the current scope?" The kitchen went quiet. Not the whole house. Just the kitchen, where my father had walked in to refill his coffee and was now standing very still next to the refrigerator, holding an empty mug, looking at us. I told Paul that 12 months worked. We could top terms on Tuesday. Paul nodded, shook my hand, and walked back to the living room. My father didn't say anything. He filled his mug. He walked out. But that wasn't the thing. The thing happened 40 minutes later, when the neighbors had gone home and it was just family. My mother was in the middle of proposing that everyone stay for New Year's, talking about how Tanner could bring the kids and it would be so nice. And she was looking at Tanner and Celeste and not at me, and I genuinely thought, I could just leave. I could drive back to the Airbnb and text a goodnight and nobody would really notice. And then Vera said, from her armchair, "Lucille." That was my mother's name. "Do you know what your daughter does for work?" My mother blinked. "She does web design, Vera," I just said. "No," Vera said. "No," Vera said. She had the steady voice of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was choosing now, specifically now, to stop being patient. She runs a digital consultancy. She has 6 employees. Her largest client is a commercial real estate firm that operates across 4 states. And the man who just shook her hand in your kitchen is the reason that firm hired her. Nobody said anything. My mother looked at me. Not the polite look she used at dinner parties. A different look. A slower one. Tanner cleared his throat. "Why didn't you ever?" my mother started. "You never asked," I said. It came out quieter than I expected. Not angry, just factual. The way you state something that has been true for a very long time and simply hasn't been acknowledged yet. "You've never asked me what I do, Mom." Not specifically. Not once. The room was very still. My father, who had been quiet since the kitchen, looked down at his hands. Tanner said, "I didn't know either, Nadia." And I believed him. Tanner was never cruel. He was just incurious. There's a difference, and it's an important one. And I had needed years to understand that the incurious people in your life can wound you just as deeply as the cruel ones, just slower, and with less awareness of the damage they're doing. Vera looked at me from across the room. She didn't say anything. She just nodded. Once. The way she used to do when I was 9 years old and I'd done something difficult and done it right. I drove back to the Airbnb at 9:30. I sat in the parking lot for a while, with the heat on and the radio off. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. I didn't cry because I had already done that crying in smaller amounts over a long period of time, and there wasn't much left. What I felt, sitting in that parking lot, was something quieter, something closer to the feeling you get when you've been carrying a bag for so long, you forgot it was heavy, and then you set it down, and your shoulders remember what it felt like before. What happened after that Christmas wasn't dramatic. There was no single conversation that fixed everything. There was no grand apology from my mother where she listed every specific thing she'd gotten wrong. Real life doesn't usually work that way, and I'd stopped waiting for that version of things a long time ago. But some things did shift. My mother called me in January, not for any particular reason. She called to ask about my work. She asked specific questions. She wrote something down. I could hear it. She told me she'd mentioned to her book club that her daughter ran a company in Chicago, and one of the women had asked for my contact information because her son-in-law was looking to redo his firm's website. I gave her the information. I didn't make a big thing of it. Tanner texted me a week after Christmas. He said he'd been thinking about it and felt like he'd been a bad brother in some ways he hadn't fully examined before, and he was sorry. It was a long text, and it was clearly written by someone who doesn't text a lot, and that made it feel more honest. I texted him back and said I appreciated it and that I thought we probably both had some ground to make up. He sent back a thumbs up and then, after a pause, a second text that just said, "I really am proud of you though." I stared at that one for a while. I didn't change everything about my relationship with my family. I didn't cut them off. I didn't issue ultimatums. Those are choices other people make, and they are valid choices. I have friends who have walked away from toxic families and whose lives are measurably better for it, but my family wasn't purely toxic. They were people who had been careless with me in a specific and painful way and who were capable, maybe, of doing better when they understood what they'd been missing. What I changed was this. I stopped managing their perception of me. I stopped anticipating their disinterest and preemptively making myself smaller to match it. I stopped arriving at family events already braced for invisibility. If they asked, I would tell them. Fully. If they didn't ask, I would still exist. Fully. Whether they were looking or not. The consultancy hit 7 figures in revenue that February. I didn't call my parents to announce it, but when my mother called on a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks later, just to talk, which was new, and asked how things were going, I told her, clearly, with the actual number. She said, "Nadia." A pause. "That's extraordinary." I said, "I know." Vera came to visit Chicago in March, before the weather got bad. We walked along the lake in the cold, and she held my arm for balance, and we talked for 2 hours about everything. The way we always had. At one point she said, "I'm sorry it took them so long to see you." And I said, "You always saw me." And she squeezed my arm and said, "Of course I did. You were never invisible, Dee. They just weren't looking in the right places." I don't tell this story because I need anyone to be angry on my behalf, though I understand why some of you might be. I don't tell it because I want to paint my family as villains. I tell it because I spent too many years believing that if the people who were supposed to know me best didn't see my worth, that was somehow evidence that the worth wasn't there. I made myself smaller in rooms where I should have taken up space. I arranged cheese boards and built fires and cleared tables and never once said, "Do you even know what I do when I'm not here?" I know now that I should have said it sooner. Not to perform, not to prove anything, but because the people we love deserve to know us. And we deserve to be known. You don't have to shout for people to finally hear you, but you do have to stop whispering. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who have underestimated you is simply let the truth walk in on its own and say nothing while the silence does the rest.